While Erica is working her magic and getting us all set up, everybody stand up, reach for the sky, wiggle your toes. Come on, this is our last session. I need everybody alive, awake, ready to talk about, are you ready for it? Building codes, okay?
No. Standards.
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 All right, thank you, everybody. Matt. Is my colleague Gus ready? Okay. Hey, Gus, online. I
I'm
don't
ready.
see you. Can you
Should
hear
I
us?
turn my camera on? Can you all hear me?
I can hear you. Very good. All right, are we ready, team? Let's do this. Last session of the day. I'm going to keep a good timer because we're not going to go over unless you are riveted by this conversation. And I have some amazing colleagues with me here today. First of all, my name is Jennifer Goupil. I'm the Managing Director of the Structural Engineering Institute. I also serve as the Chief Resilience Officer for ASCE. So welcome to the last session of the first fabulous day. I have amazing colleagues with me here today, Kevin Oswego, and online we have Gus Sarakis, and they will do a little bit of an intro to their what they do when we get to their part, because we're going to dive right into this. What we're going to talk about today, oh, what happened? Try that again?
Are you pushing it too?
Okay,
Oh.
I'm going to push it. I'm going to drive. Okay, what we're going to talk about today, a summary of what I talked about last time, just to level set so everyone in the room understands what we're talking about in development. Then we're going to have a practitioner perspective. That's my colleague here, Kevin. We're going to have a building official perspective. That's my colleague, Gus, online. We're going to have a brief little panel between the three of us, and then we're going to open it up to you. You see that highlighted at the bottom, Q&A. That's you all. So write your questions down. We'll see if we can get through as many as we can. Okay, summary. I'm not going to give my session from last time. I'm just going to fly through it because we have colleagues with us today who were not with us last time, specifically from the insurance sector and the lending sector and some of those other financial professions who might not understand where I'm coming from when I talk about the development cycle. So I'm just going to go like super fast through all that. Civil engineers are awesome. That's what this slide says, so we're going to go through that. ASCE, what we really want to talk about when I say standards that go into the building code really is the work that we do kind of as a minimum to ensure the minimum requirements that are going across all communities. You heard a lot today about things that we can do in addition to maybe what's in the basic standards and what's in the basic codes. So if you remember this morning when Bilal showed some of his slides, he had that pyramid document on his slide. The very top of that pyramid is the standard. And why is this such an important document? It's because it sets really the minimum criteria for performance of whatever it is that document is doing. I'm going to talk a little bit about ASC 7 as our design standard, but really it's for any standard that we want to set defines the minimum. And when we make that minimum something that's available to everybody, then we set the floor really of the resilience for that community. That's the way I'm thinking about it here today. Again, why standards matter. Standards determine the how to design and construct the variety of buildings and infrastructure. Standards rely on that research and data that we have all been talking about that comes from our federal partners, NOAA, NIST, FEMA, USGS, et cetera. And then our standards are adopted into our local codes. That's if, when, what matters that is constructed and permitted. So this is, if you remember what Natalie said this morning, and I wrote it down, codes are gross, maybe, but standards are good, maybe. So that's good that we can define our standards and what we want to put in there. And then it goes into the code, which is probably more like that policy document. That's the way we all talk about it and think about it. And then really it's up to the local jurisdiction to adopt and enforce those codes. And really, why do we do this? To protect the health, safety, and welfare of the public, the voices that are not involved in those decisions that we were talking about early with investment in the community and or insurance. So briefly about ASCE 7. It's really just hazards baked together with performance, so our economics and constructability. And that what comes out the other side are safe, reliable structures. So this is obviously for the buildings sector, not for our horizontal infrastructure, but it's similar in concept. We rely heavily on our federal partners to get these hazard data developed and into the standard on our cycles. We were just looking at some of the other very strong efforts that are ongoing and will continue to evolve with hazard data and development from our federal partners or whoever for serving different needs. But we rely on very specific data that comes from those federal partnerships, and we talk really closely with them to make sure what they're cooking up, we're ready to order. So that's how that works. When we talk about resilience, what I am going to talk about when I say resilience is climate-informed environmental hazard resilience. So all of our data that we use for design of buildings is historical, looking backwards. What we want to start looking at is what's coming, what is the future condition of that hazard. And if we can really look at that in total, collectively, the hurricane doesn't care where the state line is. It's just going to keep coming. So if we can think about it as this is what we know collectively for the national design standards, then those jurisdictions can decide what they want to do on top of that, if they want to grab this document. But if we create that base, that's what I'm trying to communicate to you all. That's what the standards and the purpose is. So getting to the point of the process for design, for standards and code adoption, and then we're going to talk about what happens outside of this process. So all of that data goes into the development of the standard goes into the code as we talked about before, and then that's adopted by the jurisdiction. Some of you have seen this before. This is my fun slide. Once that happens, then the code becomes law. Once that jurisdiction adopts it, then your design standard also becomes the requirement. Again, raising all boats. The timeline for this is quite lengthy. The design standard or the design research, a couple of years, development of the standards, another 4, 5, 6 years, adoption in the code, another handful of years, and then adoption by the jurisdiction. So we're looking, when all this is said and done, is about a decade from the inception of the research into enforcement by the jurisdiction. So that's a long time when we think about that. Currently, we're talking about some of the data that might go into ASCE 728 that's picking up some of this environmental, climate-informed environmental hazards. Many of the colleagues here in this room, Gus, Kevin, others in this room, Dawn in particular, are leading this work to bring forward some of that climate-informed design hazard into our design standards. But still, that's going to come out in 2032. So we have a ways to go. So when we talk about what can we do in the interim, a lot of the things that we can do can fit into the framework of the regulatory environment that is building codes and standards. So how do we do that? So my big takeaway, adoption of modern building codes and standards will definitely improve our community infrastructure resilience. Federal investment is critical, as we all know from our federal partners. ASCE works really hard to look right now currently about what is happening in the future to bake those into our very long development cycles, but alternatives to these cycles are possible. And so that's what we want to try to get to today. What is possible? So how do practitioners and jurisdictions leverage the power of that regulatory framework when their needs are outside the timeline for development? What if they need something faster than their local jurisdiction is ready to adopt it? What if their needs are outside the specific methods that might be available in those adopted codes and standards? We're going to talk about that too. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Kevin, who's then going to turn it over to Gus, and we're going to talk about what happens when we're putting knowledge into practice. Thank you. I'll give you a hook if you get too long.
Okay,
Go ahead.
Sounds good. Thank you, Jennifer. Let's see. Yeah, I'm Kevin Oswig, and I'm a principal with Magnuson Clemensic Associates in Seattle, Washington. I was born and raised right here in Virginia, went to Virginia Tech, moved to Seattle for work. Been out there for quite a while. So I'm a practicing structural engineer. I think I'm here to represent engineers in general. I work on buildings, but obviously engineers do many other things. I sit in a lot of meetings with architects and developers who constantly complain about the things we tell them, so I was really happy earlier when I heard someone say, I want to hear what the engineers have to say. That was nice to hear. So what I want to talk about is shortening this 10-year timeline that Jennifer mentioned to go from research and knowledge that we get and translating that into actual built construction. It takes 10 years or longer in many cases. And we've become adept in certain circumstances, particularly on the seismic side, at taking research and turning that into practice in a much shorter time frame, maybe months or a year or two. For example, some of you may be familiar with what's called performance-based design or performance-based seismic design. On the West Coast, we've been doing this for a couple decades now. You know, the building code has a requirement, ASC 7, a standard that's adopted by the IBC, has a requirement that tall buildings over 240 feet in a high seismic zone have to have what we call a backup moment frame. So a shear wall central core on its own is not sufficient. You have to provide this backup moment frame. If you do that and if you follow the building code, you are deemed to comply with their performance targets. And their performance target is a 10% probability of collapse conditioned on the occurrence of a major earthquake. But we know that we never actually check that. You're just deemed to comply if you provide this backup moment frame. With performance-based design, using advanced modeling, earthquake simulations, we're able to directly interrogate that probability of collapse and show that we can meet the performance target without the moment frame. And we use less materials, we get better construction, faster construction that is better performing and cheaper for the developer. So it's a win-win-win-win for everyone. But it requires using advanced knowledge and peer review and engaging the building officials. To the extent this is a map of San Francisco, these are buildings that have been built in the past 10 to 15 years. These are all designed using performance-based seismic design. So at this point in time, it's essentially the standard of care on the West Coast. However, there are some challenges for incorporating new ideas into the building code. And the number one challenge is the most basic of animal instincts, right, or animal feelings, which is fear, right? Everyone is afraid of something. And when it comes to incorporating new ideas, you know, the fear it's equally spread around. Jurisdictions, for example, and Gus may speak to this a little bit more later, but they don't really want to be the first one to do something new, right? There's this new technology, this new research, maybe it's related to hurricane simulations or rain or snow or earthquake or new materials. Being the first one to do it exposes them to some element of risk. You know, what if it turns out later that the science was wrong? You know, and they don't feel that they're in a position to really thoroughly vet what's being proposed to them. Owners, developers are afraid of delays, hidden costs, negative outcomes. What if the public learns that you did something different outside of the building code? And designers are afraid of getting it wrong. Right? We're taking a risk, we're going out on a limb, and there's no guarantee that it will succeed. One thing that will help us overcome that fear is having consensus in the industry. And this is where organizations like ASCE, NOAA, USGS, NIST, they can really help. Right? They bring the experts together via publications, papers, workshops like this. We help us develop some consensus. But there are challenges there as well. Right? And many of us in the room are engineers, scientists. We all like to measure things. Right? Things that are measurable are easy to discuss. But the problem is a lot of the things we're talking about are not easily measurable. There is no absolute truth. Right? So for example, in the building code, we have to balance risk on behalf of the public. What do we consider an acceptable level of collapse? I don't know, but we make those decisions all the time on the behalf of an unaware, unknowing public. In fact, I had a discussion this morning with a developer in DC, and I told him that I was coming here to talk about this, and I said, you know, one of the things that we want to do is take this great new science that everyone's working so hard to develop and bring it into the building code even faster. And he said, why would you want to go faster? He said, every time you guys change the building code, it gets worse. It's like, oh, well, that's an interesting perspective. He's a member of the public, and his opinion is it's getting harder and harder to build. We need to be making it easier to build. So building codes and regulations must consider human safety, serviceability, and functionality. Human safety is arguably the easiest one, right? We can all agree that we want buildings to be safe. We don't really all agree in our building codes that we want them to be serviceable or functional. Now, we all obviously want that, but generally our building codes don't include that as a requirement. And then finally, I wanted to speak a little bit on what can ASCE do, ASCE and others. I'll give you a couple quick examples. So in Seattle, where I'm from, the University of Washington and USGS and others got together and they conducted this really long study that they called the M9 study. It was a simulation of magnitude 9 earthquakes on the Cascadia subduction zone and what effects they would have on the whole Northwest, from Northern California up through Seattle. And what they found is that the amplification of the ground motions due to what's called the Seattle Basin, which you can imagine a several hundred feet deep bowl of jelly when it's shaking around and amplifies the earthquakes and hits Seattle, that amplification was far worse than what our building codes were considering. And so as the city of Seattle learned about this, they actually pulled together a group of experts. I attended the workshop in 2017, 2018, I think it was, and we went through the data and we all collectively agreed, here's how we're going to change and implement this research into our building code now. So we didn't wait. Seattle issued a director's rule that year requiring implementation of these revised results in their design process. So that's one example. Another one, Don's sitting right here, performance-based wind design. This is one where we're pushing the bounds on how we're designing any building really, but mostly tall buildings for wind design, taking from performance-based seismic design and applying some of those applications. And then finally, what can be done by ASCE specifically in conjunction with others helping? Right, so we talked about codes and standards already. Codes and standards could be tweaked to encourage some performance-based design elements and incorporate them in. Peer review is an obvious one, right? That's something that can give jurisdictions, designers, owners, everyone some degree of confidence that what's being proposed has been thoroughly vetted. Pre-standards, this is something that the Performance-Based Design Committee is working on right now for various hazards. How about helping to make the business case? Right, so often we only change the building code when things get worse, when we realize there's been a mistake and we have to go fix it. But we also want to try to make the business case for better performing buildings, lower cost, because we need more housing, we need more of everything in this country, better use of materials, and less use of materials, because that ties into sustainability. So there's a whole business case here that ASCE and our industry in general can help make. And then I listed one last thing here as a teaser. I said referee, which maybe ASCE could one day think about how to help resolve competing disagreements, if you will, between designers and building officials and developers and peer reviewers. Okay, with that, I'm going to turn it over to Gus.
Thank you. All right, Gus, you're up. You just tell me when you want me to switch the slide.
Perfect. Thank you, Jennifer. And thank you very much for the great intro component there, the engineer's perspective. I'm Gus Sarakis. I'm Deputy Commissioner for Development and Technical Affairs at the New York City Department of Buildings. My personal background, I am a covering structural engineer. I've been working for the New York City Buildings Department for about 20 years. Before that, I worked in the private sector on the engineering side, on the structural engineering side for buildings for about 10 years. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some of the work that I've done here at DOB and how it relates to putting knowledge into practice. I think locally here in New York City, we're a jurisdiction of 1.1 million buildings, 75% of which are 1- and 2-family homes, and 75% of which are probably built before 1938. So we have a wide array of structures and I think buildings that would fall into our purview and really our responsibility to make sure that we have codes and standards and practices that cover the vast array of building that's going on any given day, as well as all of the existing structures. Next slide. So from the building's official perspective, one of the things that I've done is work on code revision. I was part of the team that helped bring the I-codes to New York City. From prior to the 1900s, we've had a local New York City code. In 2008, for the first time, we adopted the I-codes into our process here. This was really a post 9/11 recommendation that we should really coordinate our codes and standards with what is going on nationally. While our locally grown code was originally probably based on the BOCA codes, it was still a homegrown, home organizational structure code. And really, there's a lot of benefits to us adopting the I-codes themselves. While it still maintained a lot of our local practices, but it we put it into the organizational structure of the I codes and have been working to keep up to date since. After having gone 40 years without a significant revision, it was quite a big jump to adopt the I codes from that standpoint. But in between, building officials always had tools available to them to accept new standards. And there are similar provisions throughout the country depending on the jurisdiction, but typically we're looking for an equally safe alternative as to what can be accepted. There's always a new piece of technology, whether it's on the structural side, the MEP side, fire alarm side, or even the means and methods of construction or the design parameters that we look at that can be accepted. And I think the key word from a building official is you're always looking for something that's equally safe. I really also like the reference to fear and fear of being first. I think one of the fears that we face on a regular basis is the lack of predictability, the fear of the just unknown outcome. If we can give someone a predictable outcome, they can evaluate whether or not they want to go down that path or pursue a different road completely, whether it's a prescriptive code path or some other use. And more recently, I think here, there have been a lot of focus on alternative materials and designs and how to accept them into the construction practices here locally. I think a big thing from our standpoint was the 2008 New York City Construction Codes actually established a section for alternative materials, similarly cited in the I codes. But we also established an office, the Office of Technical Certification and Research, that was tasked primarily with looking at alternative means and methods of construction, alternative materials, and how to improve those processes. So rather than just dealing with the local borough office, who's also doing traditional plan review and approval at the same time, and trying to work in the alternative materials and all these alternative design processes into their day-to-day transactions, we have a unit that's dedicated to looking at these practices and alternative products as they come around. And our code explicitly states, just like many other codes, that we have no intention of preventing the installation of any material or prohibit any alternative design. And that would include some of the performance-based methods that are being talked about, but it also comes back to a finding that design complies with the intent of the code. It's at least equivalent in quality, strength, effectiveness, and safety, but equally safe, I think, is where this comes about. And a very important step is prior approval required. And I think the idea of predictability is where that office is trying to make its mark and to really identify and set the table for how does one go about doing such a thing and making it a little bit more predictable, but at the same time being flexible enough to allow for different types of products. So you can imagine all the various products that come through such an office that they are doing all sorts of research and relying in many instances on peer reviews and industry input for many of their product groups. Next slide. Here's some examples of alternative products where, you know what, the industry as a whole could not have a meeting of the minds at the standards level, where we were being asked to consider the use of high strength rebar. In particular, I think it was 97 KSI rebar. Way back in 2010, we have a process here where we evaluated the products, and we relied, in this instance, on the International Code Council Evaluation Service. And to provide the transparency and predictability and to get around some of the fear that was described there, and to identify for, you know, future generations, well, what have we done as far as design and construction, we put out our criteria in what are called buildings bulletins, what we term as buildings bulletins. We publish them on our website. They are not manufacturer specific, and the intention is that anybody who meets these particular set of criteria, follows the path that we've set forth in these documents, they can go forward and use a similar process on their project or for their product. In this instance, we actually had a couple of different manufacturers, two different types of steels both exceeding the capacities in 318. I think to some degree, some of this has been incorporated into later editions of ACI 318. So we have since rescinded one of those buildings bulletins by saying it's only applicable for earlier approved projects. But in some instances, this building's bulletin still lives on and is still in use. Next slide. Then, depending on the scenario, we're asked to accept performance-based designs. In some instances, fire design, or other performance-based methods. Here's an example of a unique structure that wanted to take advantage of performance-based fire design and including some alternative material approvals that we reviewed. The submissions went through, and I think we were a good partner with the design team and the ownership team here to make sure that we were making sure that the product actually, the end result was equally safe. We had comments on the input. We did change some of the criteria that was used as part of the analysis that went into the design of this structure. And I think ultimately we ended up with a very unique structure that met the owner's design intent while not following the explicit provisions of the code. And I think this was a good example of early engagement by the ownership team with the buildings department and continuous dialogue with both our subject matter experts as well as with the design team and the ownership team to understand where everyone was headed with the particular product. Sometimes it's not the design methodology, sometimes it's the inputs and the ability of evaluating prescriptive methods versus the performance-based results and seeing where all of these land. Next slide. Similarly, we have a rather unique scenario in New York City of folks buying property and wanting to buy air rights over adjacent properties and choosing to cantilever a new structure over an existing structure. In order to make sure that we are getting equally safe provisions here, we worked out through our local code revision process, we worked out the need for some performance-based fire analysis and design to make sure that we're getting a consistent result across all of the various projects that were going to be utilizing these provisions. We put out a buildings bulletin spelling out this criteria of what we would expect to be submitted, how we would evaluate it from our end, what some of the minimum inputs were that we would accept from that standpoint. And this took a lot of effort from both Department of Buildings staff as well as industry stakeholders. We ran our own little mini committee and standards development, running drafts by industry stakeholders as well as internally reviewing and providing feedback before ultimately publishing this document that was used on a number of projects successfully. Next slide. And lastly, we have, of course, there's always local legislation that building officials and architects and engineers have to deal with. Some instances, they delve into the standards development process. As part of the adoption of the 2008 code, one of our mandates as part of that local legislation was to include stakeholders. Our most recent code revision process, which kicked off in 2023, included hundreds of stakeholders from across every relevant group you can imagine that have a touch point on buildings. But here's an instance that I'm highlighting here where our zoning resolution is referring to standards to be developed by our Department of Environmental Protection in combination with projections from the New York City Panel on Climate Change to include future conditions for flood risk internal from flood risk that are inland flooding and not just coastal flooding. And this will then be utilized to allow new ancillary dwelling units to be placed outside of those inland flood risk areas. we're still waiting on more information for these maps to be adopted. We hope to have something quite soon. With apologies for the interruption. But the idea of we are pushed some instances, not just from builders, from engineers, from architects, but many instances from the local jurisdiction itself, from the legislature, from the state, to advance areas, and they will, in some instances, task us to develop the standards as a local jurisdiction. We will do the best that we can with input from architects, engineers, consultants, federal partners where possible, etc. Thanks. I think that's all I have for you, Jennifer.
All right, thank you, Gus. I appreciate that. So we have about 10 minutes left in our session. I'm going to ask just a brief question of my two panelists here, and then we're going to go to questions from you all. We'll save a little bit of time at the end. So these were a few thoughts that were organized by the committee. I think what Gus and Kevin gave you are examples on hazards that we all.
It's not being seen up there.
I'm not controlling that. Matt is, but he'll work on that.
Okay.
I lost my train of thought. So what I was saying is Gus and Kevin have given us a few examples with known hazards, seismic, things like high strength, rebar, things that structural engineers are really comfortable with and used to working within, so we can go outside the bounds of what is typical or already written into the standards and codes. Now we're kind of venturing into this area of climate-informed environmental hazards. This is, again, something kind of outside of what's in the current design standards and codes, but how are we going to deal with that? How are we going to look at that from a design professionals perspective here in Kevin, but also Gus as the jurisdiction who's really looking at that. So I wanted to pose this question. I'm going to go kind of a combination of these, if you will. You kind of address what ASCE might be able to do. But really, from your perspective, Kevin, and Gus mentioned this as well, predictability and kind of eliminating or mitigating the fear of the unknown seem to be the biggest, I would say, what you all commented on challenges to going into something that's maybe outside the building code. Where do you see where we could have technical or policy changes that would be represent the greatest challenge to overcoming those? But I like the flip side of that question. What would make it easier to use these alternatives? When we were having some pre-meetings on this, one of our colleagues said, well, all of these things are easy to do in the regulatory environment if they're cheaper and faster and everyone's happy about it, right? Like those are real easy to do. But as we start getting into the hazards and predicting out into the future, what are some of the things that might make it a little bit easier for us? So Kev, you touched on that a little bit. Is there any other comments you want to add from your perspective?
You were kind enough to share that question with me ahead of time, so I was able to touch on it in the slides. But I think I share the example of what Seattle did with the basin effects, where they brought together a group of experts and they quickly developed a director's rule for this is how we're going to implement this.
Mm-hmm.
That similar thing happens all up and down the West Coast. San Francisco has their own method. They rely heavily for structural questions on the Structural Engineering Association of Northern California. And when they need a group of experts to weigh in on something, there's some new science that comes out that suggests the code is unconservative or there's a new methodology, they get people together in a room, including representatives from the city of San Francisco, the building official, industry experts, academics. They work together collaboratively on how to approach the problem, how to solve the problem. They all agree on the solution, and then the city issues it as a memorandum that says this is how we're going to do it, until the building code can catch up.
I see.
And I think really just breaking down walls, like what we're doing here, but doing that all across the country, and the needs will vary based on where we live and what the hazard is. But just getting people together, getting the right people in the room, and agreeing to move quickly. And you're never going to get things perfect, but the outcome is better than what we have right now.
So in summary, it might be that collective decision making, as you described earlier, kind of eliminating some of the fear factor. If we all kind of huddle and think, this is our gut check, we all kind of think it's okay. Gus, what are your thoughts on that from the jurisdiction and enforcement perspective?
Oh, I agree with what Kevin is describing that's done there. That's exactly what we've been doing in my 20 years here at DOB. I think that's been one of the most rewarding parts of, the practicing of engineering inside the buildings department is the collaborative efforts to develop and implement this, develop standards or implement standards and customize them to what we locally need here. I don't think you can do it in a vacuum. I think the buildings departments, the local authorities having jurisdiction, play a significant role. In some instances, you need the additional input of other authorities having jurisdiction, such as the fire service, and having that larger collaboration, letting everyone in to see how and what goes into these requirements and these design methodologies really goes a long way to assuaging any concerns that people might have. And I do think that there has to be some level of standardization. I think where there is a national standard, an accepted standard of care, practice, whatever it might be, that sets boundaries and guide rails without stifling the innovation, that is a huge benefit because no property owner, the debates that we see, we're typically the face of no as a jurisdiction, is how building owners see us, as we're the ones who say no to their requests. And of course, the neighbors are also the ones that see us as we're the ones that said yes to the thing that they don't want in their backyard. So from that standpoint, having a transparent process that we can point to say that we really put this to the test by real professionals who have thought about this from every angle within a reasonable amount of time, I think makes the most sense, and it gives you the best outcome for all of them.
Thank you, Gus. I remember one of our discussions earlier too, you saying, well, you guys talk about it at the city and say, well, gosh, what's LA doing? What's Miami doing? Kind of that gut check that we're all talking about when there's something new that comes out. No one wants to be the first. Someone said that earlier this morning as well. Okay, so keeping an eye on the time, I'm going to go to the Q&A for you all. If you have questions for these folks about adoptions, we have a Matt or somebody have a microphone for Gary. We have a question here. And then you can monitor online for me. Erica?
Yep.
Okay. All right, we're just getting a microphone, Gus. Hang on. Thanks, Gary.
Not quite in the room where everyone automatically knows who I am.
Yeah.
Gary Ehrlich, NAHB. So a question that came to my mind, I guess this is primarily for Kevin, as you were talking about the performance-based design. You were showing the example of, Seattle, where, right, the code imposes a prescriptive limit or prescriptive backstop, on a high rise. The PBD showed a, more cost-effective way to, achieve the same performance. But, raised the question in my mind, to what extent do the performance-based design tools that we have, right, in addition to doing what, something like you could do for the high rises, is there a way that we could use those same tools to, interrogate things like some of those prescriptive limits in the code, find a way where, maybe they're not necessary for certain buildings, and understanding, right, you can't necessarily use the performance-based design techniques, but find out where using, right, the existing, common building code or common design tools, right, are there possibilities that, maybe some of those limits aren't required, so maybe you could do things in a more cost-effective way that actually even still increase, performance over current standards.
Yeah, Don and I were looking at each other and shaking our heads, yes. So we're both on, Don is the chair of the Performance-Based Design Committee for SEI, and I'm the vice chair, so we talk about things like this all the time. Today, as it stands right now, performance-based design is primarily used for larger structures, and it's used to design a system. there's no reason it couldn't be used to evaluate individual components, on a home, maybe some of the bracing or some clips, or, on a smaller scale, something that's maybe a less total cost, but when you multiply by 1 million homes, it's a much bigger deal. That comes into the idea, you need testing, you need some method to prove that it works. And once you have that, then you bring it to a jurisdiction, you engage engineers, other stakeholders, and ideally, if you have an open jurisdiction, you can get it moving along through the process and into adoption before it would make its way into a building code.
Gus, do you have any comment on that before we go to the question online?
Yeah, no, I think what Kevin is describing is be accurate. I think the idea of depending on the only component I would add to that would be the local jurisdiction might be both either supported or restricted in how they operate based on their own local legislature. Local amendments sometimes can either help facilitate adoption of new alternative products or design methods, or they can it can actually restrict you. So I think that's the only other caveat there that can come to play.
Okay, looks like we have one online, and that'll probably do it for us.
Lou, do you want to unmute and just speak to your question? If not, I can read it for you.
Yeah, sure. I just wanted to ask Deputy Commissioner Siraclis. You mentioned a lot of your building stock was 1938, pre-40s. I mean, one of the challenges we have is cost-effective retrofitting. You have any thoughts in terms of, how to improve the overall resilience with that older building stock, given the challenges of going in and retrofitting?
Yeah, that has been a significant challenge for us as well from that standpoint. I think, we have a lot of unreinforced masonry buildings. They are all, many of them, I should say all, but they're all sharing, not all of them, but many of them sharing walls, party walls from that standpoint. Post Sandy, we had scenarios where multiple buildings in a row of properties were damaged, but only some to the point that required maybe a prescriptive elevation where others did not. So this is an ongoing challenge from that standpoint. What we have tried to do is aim for prescriptive retrofit measures that are typical to a particular category of buildings or unique building stock. We're trying to take advantage of the fact that earlier codes were very prescriptive in nature and not just design methodology, but where if your wall is this many stories tall, it must be this many bricks wide. That you know that when you're walking up to a particular type of building, if you can tell by the era, the construction without having to see a set of plans, because there were no plans maybe from that era. We currently have introduced locally in our legislature a existing building code. We have not adopted the IEBC locally. We could not utilize it locally was what the feeling was collectively, given the age of our building stock. But we tried to take advantage of our local building typologies and crafted specific provisions for what to do in those particular building typologies when working within those buildings, and crafted our own existing building code. I'll be glad to share the draft there. It was drafted in consultation with the ICC and local consultants and the buildings department. It's ICC based, but it's not the EBC from that standpoint. But we tried to take advantage of the predictability of the older building stock to come up with very prescriptive, but maybe not completely the equivalent design provisions of what you'd get from new construction.
Okay, yeah, super, great activities. Thank you very much. And I'll work to connect you with our operations engineering in New York. Maybe we can help out. Thank you.
Thanks, Lou. And I want to just wrap us up and thanks Kevin and Gus for joining us this afternoon, and thanks for your patience here on the last one of the day. We're gonna turn it back over to Bilal, and thank you.
Yeah, Thank you so much. This concludes day one, and tomorrow we'll start same time, 8:30 for networking. 9 the program will start, but we'll finish at 3. The end we'll adjourn at 3. If you'd like to leave with ASC permission, you could leave your name tag and your materials in here, not your laptop, but other materials, right? Okay. Thank you so much, and have a good evening. No plans for dinner. You could connect and make your own plans.